I never intended to spend more than a few hours inside the sanatorium's archive. It was supposed to be nothing more than a quiet evening of research, sifting through mold-eaten folders for scraps of history that might enrich a paper I had been preparing. Yet from the moment I unlocked the heavy iron door and the scent of damp concrete and paper rot greeted me, something in the air pressed against me with a weight I could neither define nor shake off. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows shuttered, its hallways hollow, and yet the silence did not feel empty. It felt poised, listening. The archive itself was tucked away in the basement, down 2 flights of stairs that groaned under my weight, the sound swallowed by the stale air. I remember pausing halfway, pressing my palm to the railing, and thinking how cold it felt, as though the metal had not been touched by a living hand for far longer than the dust on it suggested. When I reached the bottom, the air grew denser, filled with the mineral sting of wet stone and the faint sweetness of decayed wood. I switched on my flashlight, and its beam struck rows of cabinets and shelves, their drawers labeled with faded tags. My footsteps echoed softly, bouncing against the low ceiling. I had come prepared to dig into patient records, nightly logs, and medical protocols that had been abandoned when the sanatorium was shut down in the early 70s. I thought I was looking into someone else's past. I had no reason to imagine it might intersect with mine. I began with the night patrol reports. They were kept in thin, brittle folders, each page marked with stamps and a meticulous handwriting that belonged to different orderlies and nurses who had once patrolled the corridors long after patients had been locked away in their rooms. The reports were repetitive. Notes of lantern checks, doors secured, minor disturbances like a patient moaning in sleep or asking for water. I skimmed them mechanically, stacking them by year. It wasn't until I noticed my own name that the air around me seemed to shift. The ink had faded, but there was no mistaking it. My surname, spelled precisely, in a report dated 1963. I froze, the edges of the page crackling under the tension of my grip. I told myself it must be a coincidence, that some long-forgotten patient or staff member had borne the same name. But as I read further, a strange recognition spread through me. The report described the researcher with the folder in hand standing at the junction near Ward 7, and I felt the blood drain from my face because that was exactly where I had been standing less than an hour earlier, folder tucked beneath my arm, as I had first entered the archive hallway. The note continued. He pauses, listening. There is a whisper in the corridor, though no one follows. He does not yet understand he has been observed. I dropped the page. It landed face down on the dust-caked floor, and the sound seemed impossibly loud. For a moment, I stood paralyzed, my ears straining against the silence. And that was when I heard it. A faint, breath-thin murmur, like words spoken just at the edge of comprehension, drifting from the far end of the corridor. My rational mind told me it was air moving through cracked walls, but the part of me that still clutched the flashlight tighter knew it was not. I forced myself to pick the report back up and return it to the folder. My hands trembled, making the brittle paper shiver. I wanted to leave, but another part of me, a darker curiosity, drove me deeper. I opened more folders, each time finding entries that mirrored what I was experiencing in that very moment. A note from 1965 described the sound of shoes on the basement stairwell, steady but hesitant. And I remembered how I had descended those same stairs minutes before. Another from 1967 mentioned the archivist coughing softly, as though unsettled by the dust. And I had indeed coughed, the taste of mildew still on my tongue. The farther I read, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. The smell of damp stone thickened, and I could hear faint cracks in the ceiling, as if the building itself was shifting above me. My body prickled with a sensation that I was not alone. At one point, the flashlight flickered and dimmed, and for a few seconds I stood in near darkness, the whispering louder now, curling like smoke through the rows of cabinets. I considered fleeing then, My instincts screamed for it, but the reports felt like a trap I had already sprung. If they knew what I was doing, if they had recorded it decades before it happened, then leaving now would not change the fact that something had already anticipated my movements, perhaps even my thoughts. And so I convinced myself, half out of fear, half out of obsession, that the only way forward was to understand. I came across a thicker folder, its cover darker, as though moisture had seeped into it long ago. The label was almost illegible, but I could make out the words, "Special Protocols." My breath fogged faintly in the beam of the flashlight as I opened it. Inside were reports less clinical, more personal. Orderlies describing sensations of being watched, of their own names whispered back to them from empty rooms, of dreams bleeding into their patrols. One entry caught my eye. The handwriting was different, uneven, as though written in haste. He returns often. Each time he believes he is the first. The papers change when he touches them. We hear him reading aloud even when no one is here. His presence echoes forward. I stared at the page, throat tightening. It was not written to describe a random figure. It was describing me, in this very moment, reading their words. The flashlight slipped in my grip, and the beam swept across the archive, catching the glint of glass in a broken cabinet door. For a fleeting second, I saw a reflection that was not mine. A figure standing just a step behind me, indistinct, like a smear of shadow shaped vaguely in my stance. When I turned, there was nothing. Only the shelves, the dust, and the oppressive weight of silence. But the whispering had grown clearer. I could almost make out syllables. They weren't entirely foreign, but not entirely familiar either, like half-forgotten words from a dream I once had. I closed the folder and pressed it against my chest, as though shielding myself from the sound. But the pages seemed to hum faintly, as though they themselves were resonating with what lingered in the building. I told myself I needed to stop, to put everything back, to lock the archive door and never return. And yet I couldn't. Something had already shifted inside me. A question had been planted, one I could not ignore. If these reports had recorded me decades before my birth, then what was I in relation to them? An echo? A repetition? Or perhaps not the first version of myself to come here at all? The night outside must have deepened by then, though I had no sense of time in the windowless basement. The only measure was the weight of exhaustion creeping into my limbs, paired with a feverish clarity that kept me turning page after page. I no longer skimmed the words. I devoured them. Each new entry described some small action I had just taken. The way I rubbed my temple, the way I shifted my stance to ease the ache in my legs, even the faint, involuntary sigh I had let out. I felt stripped bare, as though the reports were writing me even as I read them. My identity, my choices, seemed less like decisions and more like lines already inked in paper. And for the first time, a seed of doubt gnawed at me. Had I come here freely? Or had the act of reading about myself lured me to complete a cycle already written long before? I heard the sound again. The floorboards above, creaking under weight. Not mine. Not anyone I could see. The sound traveled across the ceiling, slow, deliberate, until it reached the stairwell. My breath caught as the steps began descending, one by one, though no figure appeared. The whispers swelled, filling the archive like a gathering tide. I gripped the flashlight and folder tighter, rooted in place as the unseen presence approached. And in that suspended moment, I understood with chilling clarity. I was not uncovering the past. The past was uncovering me. The footsteps never reached the last stair. They stopped, as if whoever or whatever was descending had paused, waiting for me to make the next move. My skin prickled as though the air itself were crawling across me, each hair on my arms standing stiff. The whispers thickened, overlapping into a low chorus that seemed to breathe just behind my ears. It was not quite language, not yet, but there was intent in the rhythm of it, like the tide pulling against a stranded boat. I raised the flashlight and aimed it toward the stairwell. The beam illuminated the chipped stone steps, the rail slick with rust. Empty, yet the sense of presence was undeniable, a weight pressing forward into the room, as though the archive itself was exhaling something long contained. I backed against one of the shelves, the metal rattling faintly under my weight, and for the first time the thought pierced me with clarity. Perhaps I was not merely being watched. Perhaps I was being remembered. I forced myself to speak, my voice brittle and dry. "Who are you?" The sound fell flat, as if absorbed by the walls before it could echo. For a long breath, there was nothing, only the steady beat of my heart in my ears. Then, as though in response, the whispers hushed into silence, replaced by the faint scrape of paper. I turned the light toward a nearby table. One of the reports had slid forward, its pages rustling though no draft stirred the air. With trembling hands I approached. The page that revealed itself bore the same meticulous handwriting, though this entry was unlike the others. It was addressed directly. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. What you think of as choice is the fulfillment of memory. Ours, yours." The letters seemed almost to quiver on the page, and as I read them, the silence in the archive deepened, until it felt like a vacuum around me. I pressed my hand to the paper, and the cold that leapt into my skin was not that of stone or dampness, but the absence of time itself. My breath came shallow, and I knew with aching certainty that every moment I remained here, I was sinking deeper into something I could not easily climb back from. Still, I read on. The entry described a figure arriving with folders in hand, his face marked by the same strain each time. And then, chillingly, he begins to suspect his own reflection is not entirely his. I swallowed hard, recalling the glimpse of that shadowed double in the broken glass. My hands trembled so badly, I nearly dropped the flashlight again. The idea began to claw at my thoughts, that the sanatorium had not been abandoned at all, not in the way we think of abandonment. Its walls had preserved not emptiness, but impressions, echoes, replays of all who had moved through them. And some part of me had already been here long before tonight, leaving behind a trace, a recording that I now read. Or perhaps it was the other way around, that I was nothing but the continuation of that trace, drawn back here again and again to complete a cycle whose origin was lost in the dust of decades. The sensation of not being alone grew unbearable. I felt eyes, too many to count, watching me from behind the metal cabinets, from beneath the stairwell, from the very pores of the stone walls. My flashlight caught the edges of papers quivering, as though the whole archive was breathing. The whispers rose again, no longer shapeless but forming into a cadence of words, fractured, overlapping, yet unmistakable. "We remember you." I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the folder I clutched slipped open, scattering its contents across the floor. Pages drifted in slow arcs, some settling at my feet, others further out into the dark. I knelt to gather them, hands desperate, but froze when I realized the pages were no longer the same. The handwriting was familiar now. It was mine, my looping letters, my imperfect lines, describing the exact movements I was making in that moment. He kneels, his breath quickens, he sees what he has written. I recoiled, shoving the papers away as though they burned. My throat tightened with panic, but also with something more insidious, a dawning understanding that terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. If these words were mine, if they had always been mine, then the boundary between reader and writer, past and present, was already gone. I was both subject and observer, actor and archivist. The thought hollowed me. Who was I, if not the one who decides his own steps? Who was I? If every word I spoke had already been inked decades before my tongue formed it. I don't remember deciding to move, but I found myself at the far end of the archive, drawn toward a heavy wooden door I had not noticed before. It was marked only by a tarnished plaque whose letters had nearly worn away, but under the grime I could just make out a single word: Memoranda. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The door opened without resistance, the hinges sighing softly as though relieved. Inside was a smaller room, its ceiling lower, its air heavier with dust. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each stacked with leather-bound books. Their spines bore no titles, only dates, spanning decades, then centuries, impossibly reaching years before the sanatorium had even been built. I pulled one at random, its cover flaking beneath my touch. When I opened it, the ink within was pale but legible. The entries were unmistakably mine. Each page described not only my night in the archive, but other moments from my life, trivial and profound. The time I skinned my knee as a child, the night I first lay awake questioning the shape of my future, the quiet ache of loss I had carried when my father died. My life was written here in painstaking detail, line after line, as though someone, or something, had been recording me from the very first breath. I staggered back, clutching the book to my chest, my mind unraveling. The implications tore through me. I had lived believing memory belonged to me, fragile and fleeting. But here in this suffocating room, I saw that memory did not vanish. It was archived, collected, replayed, not by choice, not by mercy, but by inevitability. I was not an individual living freely in time. I was a document in an endless archive. One voice among countless others whispered back into the corridors. The whispers in the room grew louder now, but there was a new tone to them, gentler, almost mournful. They seemed to ask, not demand, "Will you remain? Or will you add to us?" My knees weakened under the weight of the question. To remain meant surrendering myself fully to the archive, becoming one of its voices, dissolving into the chorus of memory. To leave meant carrying the unbearable knowledge that I was never truly free, that every step I took would be recorded and echoed again and again, long after my body failed. I sank onto the cold stone floor, the book open in my lap, the dust rising around me. My eyes stung, though whether from tears or the sting of age-old mildew I could not tell. For the first time I felt the shape of my life as something not linear but circular, a loop folded upon itself. My defiance ebbed, replaced by a quiet, aching acceptance. Perhaps identity was not ownership, but resonance. Perhaps what mattered was not that I was unique, but that I was remembered, preserved in the voices that outlasted flesh. The whispers swelled, surrounding me, and for a moment they were no longer alien. They were familiar, they were mine. Some spoke in my voice as a child, others in the voice I carried now, and still others in tones older, worn, belonging to versions of me I could not recall but somehow recognized. I closed my eyes, and the boundary between me and them dissolved like salt into water. When I finally stood, the weight in my chest had shifted. I was not the same person who had entered the sanatorium hours before. The man who believed in his own solitude, his own independence, was gone. What remained was someone who knew himself as part of something vaster, infinite, both terrifying and profoundly melancholic. I left the book open on the table, its pages fluttering in the stale air. As I stepped back into the corridor, the whispers dimmed but did not vanish. They lingered at the edge of hearing, like the faint hum of blood in my ears, a reminder that I was never truly alone. I climbed the stairs slowly, each creak beneath my boots sounding like a signature, an entry already written. When I emerged into the night, the sky was low and gray, the air cool with the scent of rain. The sanatorium loomed behind me, its windows blind, its doors sealed. yet I felt its attention on me still. I carried nothing in my hands when I left, not a folder, not a report. And yet I knew I carried the archive within me. Every whisper, every record, every version of myself. And as I walked into the empty street, the thought came to me with a clarity sharp enough to cut. I had not discovered the archive. The archive had discovered me, and it always would.